Rube Goldberg machines aren't made to be the most efficient ways to complete a task. They're creations with the express purpose of being interesting. Without an inherent task, they're more about interlocking elements of its many cogs, often without literally being a cog. Excluding the element of intentional inefficiency, what makes the machines interesting is how different elements of the machine relate to one another. Last year, Balatro released asking a very simple task of you: pass the number on the left of the screen. This is done by playing hands that have their own values, and jokers that can modify that value in some way depending on if certain constraints are met. People describe this as a poker game, but in reality that's a light veil that hides what is in reality a math game. Reading it out sounds incredibly boring, even more so once you point out that the entire goal of the game is to add numbers together. This year, Nubby's Number Factory released. It asks you to pass the number on the right side of the screen. This is done by hitting the pegs on the board with Nubby, at which point Nubby adds that to the total. There's items that can modify the value in some way depending on if certain constraints are met, and perks that can interact with those items if certain conditions are met. On paper, this game also sounds incredibly dull. However, both of these games in practice are incredibly successful, and for good reason. They're fantastic. If there's anything that both of these games do excellently, is allowing the player to develop interesting machines. Items and jokers by themselves are quite plain. Individually, they have simple outcomes, which is by design. The impact that the individual piece has on the rest of the machine needs to be understood by the player, since the focus of these games isn't that the parts themselves are interesting, but the relationship to one another. 3D Glasses emits a burst that doubles the value of the pegs next to it, increasing the value of the majority of the board. Its condition for going off though is based on the first peg popped, so it only activates once. It's still good, but it's isolated. Then I got a perk that has the item that's in slot 3 activate multiple times so long as the item in slot 4 activates 10 times. Without another item this is useless for now, but is about to create a chain of dependencies. Entering the shop, I'm caught between some complicated choices. Some items might be useful individually, but there's a chain of dependencies waiting to be filled. Items that directly add to the score might be less useful than items that have simple conditions to activate. The value of what's written obscures what might be the value of the item's part in a greater machine. Ultimately, I go for an item that activates a lot to activate the perk to activate the item. The outcome of all of these different systems is still simple at the moment, but their dependencies on one another to complete or excel at the task makes them interesting. As more and more items come into play, understanding the relationship of different items gets slightly harder to manage, and adding and removing elements within the composition has to be more strongly considered, as the new part might be better in isolation, but detrimental in its relationship to other parts of the machine. The same goes for Balatro, although what sets Balatro and Nubby apart is how far the relationship cascade goes. While Nubby is still great for creating a machine, the point of control is squarely on the machine itself. At a basic level, both games can be segmented similarly. The player has control of the machine, and the machine interacts with the input, which the player has partial control of. In Balatro, that's the cards played, and in Nubby, that's the board and pegs. While Nubby lets you re-roll the board once around, it doesn't allow you control over the board itself. Balatro offers more control over the input, though it's important that it does it in an indirect way. The randomization of the draw is important to keep the player on their toes and consider a wide variety of options, but they can attempt to tailor aspects of the draw through modifying, expanding, and thinning the deck. Any of these choices might be good or bad depending on the context. Later into the game you might have a machine that's geared towards kings, so thinning the deck to get rid of cards that aren't kings, or adding to the deck with kings specifically increase the chance of being able to play the desired input. However, by modifying the deck in this way, you're reducing flexibility. It might be a good idea now, but could come back to bite you later. All face cards might be disabled through a boss, or a good card could appear that might have been a better choice if the deck wasn't already modified to the specific build. With this, the effect on how you modified the potential inputs can reinforce or devalue the relationship between the machine and the input. Nubby, on the other hand, doesn't have the same privilege, and as a result can run into points of play where the player stops making choices if the player has already built a machine that they're satisfied with. The player literally has to choose where they send the ball, but they've built a machine that's so strong that they're clocked out. When the player has a setup that works, the possibility of failure effectively disappears. They'll always have a Nubby, and they'll always have a set of pegs to be interacted with, and that consistency in the input has the player unable to make more room for synergy. It's not just that there's no room for risk, it's also that there's no room to expand. Through updates, the game is still open for this to potentially become a feature in the future, perhaps with the option to buy different shapes of pegs that have them bounce in more predictable ways, or pegs that have properties like flippers to make them actively keep Nubby alive for longer. Armchair game design aside, any changes to the input would have an impact on other elements of the design. Questions like how does the player gain access to the ability to modify the input only have answers that will impact other systems. The fun for the player is the Rube Goldberg machine that they make, and the challenge for the designer is keeping the environment of that machine together. This is important to understand when it comes to valuing the shop, which in my opinion completes the cycle of both games. The shop both restricts and provides flexibility to the player that holds the entire experience together. If the player was allowed to pick from every Joker in the shop in Balatro, new players would be completely overloaded from choice, and experienced players would have to self-impose restrictions to reduce repetition. The shop only letting you pick from 2 Jokers by default gives new players a simple choice, and experienced players the necessary limitation to make those choices meaningful, even with a clear understanding of what's possible. Ambiguity of the future in both games encourages players to make choices in the present even if no option is ideal. This is true of a lot of roguelikes and deck builders and roguelike deck builders. The difference here is that this simple choice early is likely to interact with another choice later. In Nubby, it might be items that work together that go on to influence the greater direction of the entire build. An item that had an influence might later be removed from the machine to make for a greater synergy later, but it still had an influence on why the machine that you've built has the chain of dependencies that it currently does. Compare this to the Binding of Isaac, where many non-consumable items exist in perpetuity. There are occasionally good choices in regards to not taking items in the first place, but often the relationship between items exists by the circumstance of what the game has put in front of you from the seed, rarely the choices that you as a player had to weigh up based on what might change the fundamental relationship between items. Taking one item is unlikely or less present to have cascading effects on another. Not impossible, just less likely. In both Nubby and Balatro, any choices made in the shop will have an impact on choices made later. The small amount of choices that need to be made help from avoiding it becoming overwhelming, while the large amount of impact that it might have keeps the game varied. Between the two, Balatro's shop has more impact though. You're going to directly benefit from the Jokers, so typically you'll end up gravitating towards that first, but you're always given choice to refine parts of the input with an equally small set of choices. This also means that unlike Nubby, you're unlikely to reach a point where you stop regarding the shop entirely. Even with an ideal set of items, you're always looking to refine the possibility of inputs, checking for planets, constantly attempting to expand even when the effective choices become narrow. Your goal, and much of the satisfaction, comes less from the game itself, but the multitude of relations inside of the machine you've created, the unpredictability of how those relations might impact the future, and the circumstance that impacts the present. I don't think either of these games are revolutionary new concepts in game design. You can see this kind of concept in games as disconnected as Halo. They're merely a new point of emphasis on pre-existing ideas, ones that I suspect are going to be the foundation for many games in the future.